Hi, I'm Lyra Kilston, author of Sunseekers, The Cure of California, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome back to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. If there was any proper time to do it, today is the day we should break out the English tea set for our first member of the peerage, serial modernist Lord Peter Palumbo, who has owned some of the most iconic houses in America. And now, bringing in his tea tray with cucumber sandwiches and some delightful raspberry scones. Why don't you share, George? Here's your host, George Smart.
Hi, folks. I do love these scones. And if Lord Palumbo was here in the studio instead of on the phone, we would try our best to create a sense of appropriate stateliness and proper English manners.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we are a young country, and we don't have a peerage in America, unless you count the Kardashians, and there are a lot of Kardashians to count. To my knowledge, however, no Kardashian has invested in a modernist house, although they have leased a few. Presidential hopeful Kanye West, who is Kardashian adjacent, believes he is an architect, and I suspect it won't be too much longer before he publishes a set of house plans. But I digress. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by our wonderful and supportive and encouraging modernist realtor, Angela Rohe.
It's episode 3 in our ongoing space saga, Revenge of the McMansions. The modernist homeworld is crumbling from deferred maintenance. The Farnsworth House, moved from Earth 3,000 years ago to avoid yet another freeway, has been purchased by IHOP, still trying to promote itself as a burger place after failing breakfast for millennia. Desperate for cash, the modernists sell one of their planet's moons to Home Depot for a galactic superstore. Under attack from the Emperor, modernist rebel leader Angela Rohe sweeps into the Republic Capitol in her ion-powered Tesla scooter and replaces all the dilithium energy crystals with Folgers crystals. Initially, of course, no one can tell the difference, but as the Republic's power source shuts down, rich, pleasing Colombian aroma covers the city. Angela attempts to flee the besieged capital hidden in an IKEA freighter built without reading the instructions. Will the IHOP follow historically sensitive renovation guidelines? Will Angela escape, or will her freighter collapse and force an IKEA recall? Back here on Earth, Angela's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter,
Epic greatness,
uses her architectural training to specialize in modernist real estate, advising buyers and sellers on everything, from appropriate renovation to locating a good coffee place in space. Angela Rohe is your special real estate agent. Reach her at angelarohle.com. That's ROEHL, or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. Lord Peter Palumbo is, among other things, a developer, art collector, car collector, wine collector, architecture collector, and conservative life peer based in the UK. He was educated at Eton and Worcester College, Oxford, a star athlete who played polo with Prince Charles, and they became friends. He first met Mies van der Rohe in the 1960s and spent much of the next 30 years trying to get a Mies building built. In 1972, he purchased the Farnsworth House by Mies in Plano, Illinois, and in 1986, he bought Frank Lloyd Wright's Kentuck knob near Fallingwater in Pennsylvania. In 1988, Palumbo became godfather to Princess Beatrice of York, the eldest daughter of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. He's been on the board of trustees of the Architecture Foundation and is a past jury chairman of the Pritzker Prize for Architecture, the Oscars of Design. He spends time each year in America at Kentuck Knob, and we're thrilled to have him on the show. Welcome, sir.
Well, I'm thrilled to be with you, and honored as well.
So before we get started, since it's probably easier to be a Kardashian here than to enter the peerage, how does one get to be a lord? Does it come with property, or is it honorary?
It comes in two ways. Either you can be born into it. That's the hereditary side. It goes from father to son. and down the line, ad infinitum, sometimes not quite as long as that, but that's the general proposition. That's one way. The other way is it can be conferred upon you in the name of the Prime Minister, usually, of the day, and on the Queen's birthday, the honours are announced, and later on in the year, around Christmas time. So it's a mixed bag. In the House of Lords, which I sit in as a life peer, in other words, doesn't go on when I die, the hereditary peers in the House of Lords have been abolished as being an anachronism, which I don't think is altogether true, and they were left with a rump of about 92 of them who still sit in the House of Lords today, and they make a valuable contribution to national life.
But after they pass away, then the title does not confer to their son?
If they are hereditary peers, it does.
Okay, so they did not abolish that.
Just the new hereditary ones.
They abolished. I mean, there were, 1,500 of them.
Wow.
And they abolished all but 92.
Okay.
So the 92, the title goes from father to son.
But yours was conferred, I'm guessing?
Mine was conferred by Margaret Thatcher. I worked for her for a number of years. My peerage was conferred for services to the arts.
Oh, lovely. Now, Prime Minister Thatcher, she also made you a baron. Is that different from a lord?
It's part of the thing. It's it becomes a little bit complicated. But the title means Lord Peter Palumbo, Baron of Walbrook. Walbrook is an old Roman street in the City of London, the downtown area of London. So if you're a peer, if you're a lord, you can choose any part of the country that you like, as long as it's not occupied by another lord.
Right.
To tack it onto your peerage.
So what is the significance of the street that you chose?
The significance of the street is the Walbrook in Roman times in 49, 50 A.D. They call it a stream. It was a bit more than a stream. It flowed through the City of London into the River Thames, and it was wide enough for Roman ships to come and tie up on its banks and unload their cargoes, which might have come from anywhere in the Roman Empire, and then be loaded with other goods that were made in Britain, and then they'd sail away again down the Thames and into the Mediterranean or wherever it might be. So it was the start of a big trading empire, actually, and a very old one. And now it is the Walbrook stream, if it exists at all, other than as the merest trickle, is 40 feet below where it was in Roman times. Michael Bloomberg, whom you will know of, has just built a magnificent building on the east bank of the Walbrook. It's 1 million square feet of office space, and the architect's Norman Foster, Lord Foster of Thames Bank.
Yes.
That's his title. And he has excavated down to the level of the Walbrook. The most, if you're ever in London, it's worth seeing, down right to the level of where the Walbrook used to run in Roman times. He's done it very, very, very cleverly, because you are taken down, 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 down. Every 5 feet, there is an inscription on the wall which tells you all sorts of the history of London, what's going on, and why 40 feet lower than it was in 50 A.D. It's a fascinating journey through the history of life, the history of architecture, and the history of a city which is a trading city and always has been, situated on the Greenwich Meridian, which means that when trading stops in New York, it starts in Tokyo. and we straddle that line, which nobody else does. So we can have, the bottom line is we can have 24-hour trading.
Right. One of my cherished pictures when I was in London years ago, straddling the line, which I imagine I'm not the only person to have had that photograph.
Yeah, you're the
taken.
only one that's ever done that.
Right, one foot in the Eastern Hemisphere,
Yes.
one in the West. I thought it was pretty clever. I'd get off on that kind of stuff.
Lord Palumbo, how did you first discover modern architecture growing up? Was it Mies that you discovered first, or was it someone else?
No. Well, it was interesting because, I mean, when you talk about modern architecture and you go back 5,000-6,000 years, and you see the tall buildings in the Yemen, in the Middle East, skyscrapers of their days, that was modern architecture. If you go and see Pericles' Athenian Acropolis and the Parthenon, that was modern architecture.
Sure.
And so the evolution has gone on and on and on. I mean, everything that was built 5,000 years ago was modern architecture. And so I think one has to be a bit careful about assuming that modern architecture is just the 20th, 21st century, because it's an evolution that's taken place with the advent of changes in society, changes in the political complexion of the country, and above all, technology. And so where did you start? If you want to start with Mies or Frank Lloyd Wright, I talked to Mies when I met him in 1962 about Frank Lloyd Wright because, of course, he was a controversial figure. His private life was tended to be a bit
messy,
unconventional, let's say. And he was really drummed out of the United States for misbehaving himself before the First World War. And he took himself to Berlin, took a few drawings with him, and made an exhibition, a small exhibition. I think, I forget the year, 1912, something like that. And it was a revelation for European architects. It sounds stupid nowadays because we can press a button and have all the information, more than we can possibly absorb. But in those days, that wasn't so. And European architects knew nothing about the man from the prairies, Frank Lloyd Wright. And Mies said to me that he saw this exhibition in Berlin in 1912, and he said, not only for me, but for all the architects of my generation, life was never the same again. Frank Lloyd Wright, they were absolutely stunned by the brilliance and the originality and the genius of his work.
You met Mies in the early 60s. I guess you were less than 30, and Mies was probably...
I was born in 1935. I'm an old dinosaur now, but I was 27.
27? And Mies was in his 60s, mid to late 60s?
No, he was 75.
75. And how did that meeting come about? What was the project that you wanted him to work on?
Well, my late father and I had an office in the very center of the city of London, right in the middle of it. There was a site there that had been developed by speculators in the early 1870s, one or two of which were rather good, but which were a jumble, really, of architectural styles. The predominant one was sort of Venetian Gothic. You know, if you'd seen them floating down the Grand Canal in Venice, you wouldn't be at all surprised. But they were higgledy-piggledy all over the place, and they were past their time. The foundations were not very good. They were jerry-built, and they were yesterday's buildings. And so one or two of them came up for sale, and we bought them, not with any idea of developing anything, actually, just because they were in the center of the city of London, which was a rather desirable place, next opposite the Mansion House where the Lord Mayor lives, within about 100 meters of the Bank of England. So My father, who was a much greater judge of these things than I was, took the view, rightly I think, that they would always hold their value. And slowly, the idea of a development took place. There were 12 freehold buildings, which means that you have the right to the land as well as the building. And then there were about 250 leasehold interests, people paying rent, sometimes as little as 1 or 2 rooms. When I went to Mies, I think we had about 40% of the site, the freehold buildings, and we still had a long way to go with the leaseholds. I went to see Mies because I thought that Frank Lloyd Wright was no longer alive, neither was Le Corbusier. The only one that was alive was Mies. And Mies had an advantage in a way, I think. I mean, you're talking about godlike figures, but Mies was a Northern European architect who had been interested in the work of Schinkel in Germany and had taken advantage of technology. He worked for Behrens, the Dutch architect, and in 1906. And Behrens at that stage had Mies, Corbusier, and Gropius working in his practice. I mean, that must have been an amazing time. Three very great architects and teachers. But Mies was the only one who was alive, and he had just completed the Seagram building in New York, and his work was still, I think, very classical, but beautiful beyond belief. And so I wrote to him and said, "You don't know me from a plum pudding, but I would love to come and see you about the possibility of offering you a commission for a building in London." And I got a letter back saying, "Delighted to see you. Come and see me a couple of weeks' time on a Monday morning." So I flew to Chicago. When I went to see Mies, I'd been reading about him, and so we got on from the start because he understood that I was a fan. I was an aficionado of his work. He said to me, "What do you want me to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd love you to come and design a building for London. There is only one condition that I have to impose and tell you straight away. It won't be built for 25 years because we have to buy up the rest of the site, the 60% we don't own, and we have to buy all the leasehold interests and this, that, and the other." Anyway, he was 75 years old at the time, and he understood at once that what I was offering him was a posthumous commission.
Let's fast forward a little bit. Mies died in 1969, and you bought his famous Farnsworth House in 1972. How did that come about?
Oh, that was interesting because he and Edith Farnsworth had fallen out over the Farnsworth House, as I'm sure you know, and it was over cost. She said that it wasn't practical, it didn't work, and apart from that, it was $30,000 over budget. And she took him to court to get the $30,000 back.
He took her to court as well for not paying his fee.
They had, yes. He countersued, and he won because he had taped their conversations when she came to see him in his office. And when she said, "I'd like, in addition to this, I would like that, and while you're about it, just do this and do that and do the other." So he could justify the $30,000 very easily. So she was defeated and embittered. They had quite a close relationship, I think. I don't say it was love, but whatever it was turned to hate. And, they weren't on speaking terms. So it was an interesting time because she put the house on the market. Now, I had come to see Mies. I first saw him in 1962, but this was 1968, a year before he died. And she put it up for sale, and I sort of heard about it, but I also read about it because I was coming to see Mies for a meeting in Chicago, and I was staying at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, and I picked up the newspaper, the Tribune, and something caught my eye. I was flipping through it, and it was one of those little classified sections for real estate, and it said Farnsworth House for sale, and then a telephone number. So I was having breakfast at the time. I rushed over the telephone. It's a weekend. It was on a Saturday, and I was going to have lunch with Mies. And anyway, I telephoned the Farnsworth House, and Edith Farnsworth picked up the phone. I explained the situation, who I was, and what I'd seen in the newspaper. And she said, "Well, why don't you come to lunch?" And I said, "Well, I'm having lunch with Mies, but I'll have a word with him and see if he can see me at some other time." I spoke to Mies. Mies said, "Don't worry, come to dinner instead, but go and see her for lunch." So I drove out there and essentially bought the house that afternoon. Now, the interesting thing was, this was the first day that the house had been advertised in the newspaper. And I happened to be in Chicago on that day to meet Mies. And it all seemed that fate was playing its hand. And when that happens in life, I believe you have to just follow. You have no idea where you're going. It's rather like working for Margaret Thatcher in some senses. But you have such belief in the final outcome, whatever that may be, that you just go ahead with it. And that's what I did. I went out. She was quite nervous because on the one hand she wanted to sell her house, and on the other she wanted to denigrate Mies and let her true feelings for him be in no doubt. So I said to her, "Look, your relationship with Mies is none of my business. I think it's the most beautiful house, and I love his work, and we shouldn't, that's all we should be talking about." In the end, the sale didn't go through till 1972, 4 years later, but she kept faith with me, and I kept faith with her. She wanted to leave the United States altogether because she was so angry and bitter at the way she'd been treated by the court here.
And by the press,
and by
too.
the local people along the Fox River, that she went to Italy and she bought a house, rather an ugly house actually, in the old part of Florence and get the furniture. And anyway, it took till 1972, but in 1972 she was ensconced in Florence and I took possession of it. So it was a memorable moment because going back to Eton, one of probably the most beautiful house I had ever seen in photographic form was the Farnsworth House. And it had just been completed. I mean, I never thought that I would ever meet Mies or get to know him, or would he become a godfather to one of my children. But that's what happened. And so it was fated to be, I think.
Now, after you bought the house, you discovered a little problem with it, that it tends to flood.
Yes, well, it did. And I was told by the insurance company that it couldn't flood because a barrage had been constructed farther down the Fox River and that it had eliminated the possibility of flooding. So they said, don't waste your money by taking out an insurance policy on a
this is an
situation
insurance
that can
company,
never arise.
As an insurance company is telling you don't buy flood insurance?
They said, don't buy it. I mean, come to us for other kinds of insurance,
right,
but not flood. You're wasting your money.
Not the salesman of the year at the insurance office.
No, it's not the salesman of the year, but I insured everything else with them. But it did flood, not dramatically, but if a house floods, it's only got to have 12 inches of water in it. All the drapes are soaked, and it does a lot of damage. The carpets, the rugs, the furniture, If it floods 2 feet, it's even worse. If it floods, as it did, it flooded 11 feet.
Oh, my goodness.
And although it was 6 feet off the ground, we still had 5 feet of water in the house. And this was in 1996. And my wife and I were in London. We were going to go out 3 days later after the flood hit. But what had happened was quite interesting because it was a time when the little township of Plano was in the path of an expansion by the city of Chicago, which was 60 miles away. And Chicago, of course, can only expand one way,
right,
towards the west. It can't go east because then it would be in the lake. So the little hamlet of Plano, Illinois, was right in the path of development. And a lot of development took place. A lot of macadam was poured. And at the same time, this is in the summer of 1996, when it should be as hot as hell, there were 3 months consecutive downpour of rain every single day. And the water had nowhere to go. It bounced off the tar macadam. It bounced off the sites that were being rebuilt. And the ditches were full. And finally, 3 o'clock in the morning, which is when all these disasters strike,
yes,
after 90 days, it's a sort of biblical story, there was a cloudburst, and that was the final straw. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, a wall of water, 16 feet high, came down the Fox River and the adjoining landscape and just demolished the interior of the house, and very nearly the whole house. If one of the glass panels in the house hadn't shattered and let the build-up, the atmospherics inside the house out, it would have been taken up by the roots and just floated down the Fox River and would have become a houseboat.
Huh.
I understand that you hired Mies's grandson, our past podcast guest, Dirk Lowen, to do the restoration.
Yes. Yeah, well, Dirk is a great friend, and he was a great friend in London. He was with me for the Mansion House Square development. He was with me in the Farnsworth House, and it was he, actually, who said, I think the Farnsworth House is for sale, before I saw it in the newspaper. And I went straight to Dirk, and we had to rebuild the interior of the house. But he had all the plans, and actually, in a way, it was rebuilt. It was much better than when it was sold to her. When it was sold to her, she did everything she could to carry out works that she knew would distress him and that were entirely contrary to what his sort of sensibility and sensitivity were. So, for example, the Primavera core, which was one of the great features of the house, Primavera wood, she varnished. But it sort of became a reddish-black color instead of this wonderful Primavera, honey-colored wood. And then she hung things on it. She hung pieces of pottery on it from shelves that projected. She screwed them into the core. That sort of thing would have upset him enormously. But it was a deliberate mark of her dislike of him.
Lord Palumbo, are you familiar with there's going to be a movie about the two of them coming out?
Yeah, I believe there is.
Were you consulted for that at all?
Nobody really knows what happened, what their relationship was. I'm sure it'll be a good movie. I mean, Mies was no saint. I mean, he used to get, you talk about Frank Lloyd Wright going off with the wife of a client in Chicago and having to sort of hightail it out of the United States. Because in 1911, that was not the sort of thing you did. Your reputation would be shredded in a second. But Mies was very much a ladies' man. He was handsome. His suits were beautifully cut. And it wouldn't have been impossible for him to have had a deeper relationship with Edith Farnsworth to get the work. I mean, he'd done it before. He did it in Germany. And then when he'd finished the work and the house or whatever it was been built, he would move on and leave the poor lady he'd had a relationship with in the lurch. So he left a bit of a trail of disappointed ladies. or I think.
When you sold the house in 2003, was it because of all the flooding?
No, it wasn't because of the flooding, because, the house was in pristine order when we sold it, because, it cost a lot of money to as you can imagine, and I wasn't insured, as I've told you. But in 1999, I had what they thought was a terminal dose of prostate cancer. But really, it wasn't so much the cancer that determined the sale. When you have shock like that, you really start to think about, do I really need the aggravation, the pressure, running a house, opening it to the public, and then getting a cloudburst and 90 days of rain and all this thing. And is this something I really need, or should I say goodbye to it?
So the cancer was really just one element of...
The cancer was one element. That sort of thing does, when you say goodbye to your wife and don't go into the operating theatre and you don't think you're going to come out, it's quite a challenging moment.
Yes.
But
it sounds like you survived.
I survived. What are we, 2019 now?
Yep.
This was 20 years ago, thanks to the brilliance of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And so I decided to keep the house in where I'm sitting now in Pennsylvania by Frank Lloyd Wright and sell the Farnsworth House.
I understand, Lord Palumbo, there's a plan to hydraulically lift the Farnsworth House when it floods?
Well, there are two plans. Dirk's plan, which I think would be very expensive, but it could be done now, and which Mies might. I always say, what would Mies think? It's such a classical house. The evolution of the Farnsworth House comes straight from Greece. It's a Greek temple in a mid-20th century meadow on the banks of the Fox River. That's what I always thought of it as. And if it had been built 5,000 years before, that's what it would have been. It was of that quality and that extraordinary brilliance, and it just takes the breath away. The other thing that happened, which was the clinching part of the thing, with this spread of Chicago westwards, it brought a lot of drugs with it and a lot of funny people. Now, for 30 years, nobody in the little hamlet of Plano or the surrounding villages had trespassed in the Farnsworth House. When I bought it from Edith Farnsworth, she had no fencing around it. They didn't walk onto her property because she had a shotgun which she'd fire over their heads. She didn't like people coming in, but there's no fencing to keep people out. But when I took it on, I had the whole thing fenced around the perimeter. But we were in the pathway of the development in Plano. People would come up, they would be drunk, drugged, they would drive their car up to the gate, jump onto the roof of the car, jump over the fencing, come down to the house. There was furniture on the upper deck. They would take the furniture and smash the windows, smash the doors, which were glass, get in, do nameless things which I won't bore you with. They didn't actually steal anything. But what they did was, if they saw a piece of sculpture or something, or a piece of glass, they would just knock it and break it and then leave. Now, this happened 3 times. And at the end of the 3rd time, I said, enough is enough. There was nobody living on the property. And the man who looked after it was about 10 miles away. And I said, that was the clinching thing.
Let's talk about one more house.
Yes.
And that's the one that you have in Pennsylvania, Kentuck Knob. I understand that you visited Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater for the first time in 1985. And you bought Kentuck Knob 6 weeks later?
It wasn't quite like that, but I mean, you're right. I've always been interested in architecture because I'm interested in music, and I think buildings actually have a sense of feeling. Certainly the Farnsworth House, and here at Kentuck Knob, the sort of mood the house is in. It doesn't just depend on the weather, but it depends on other things. Anyway, I had never seen Fallingwater. Went to see it. I had lunch with the director, who took me around afterwards, which was a revelation, of course. And he said, now, before you go back to Chicago, because I'd come from the Farnsworth House, you should see the other Frank Lloyd Wright house, the only other Frank Lloyd Wright house in Pennsylvania. And by the way, it's only 6 miles down the road, and it's for sale. So on my way back to the airport, I came here. There was no one around at all. I went up the main drive. I walked around the outside of the house and fell in love with that immediately, and went back 6 weeks later, met Mr. and Mrs. Hagen, and I thought to myself, if the house is as beautiful inside as it is out, I must try and do something about it. I went back 6 weeks later and bought it. That is absolutely true. The interesting thing was it had been on the market for 3 years, and they had not had one single expression of interest in 3 years.
That's amazing.
See, I thought again, being fanciful with fate playing its hand, the house was waiting for me. And crazy it may seem, crazier things in life have happened. But it was certainly a love affair. It's been a constant pleasure ever since.
Tell our listeners, Lord Palumbo, about your art at Kentuck Knob, because this is not just a few pieces you have around the house. You have acres of art installations around the property.
Well, a handful of them, certainly. But there again, you see, the thing that's bringing them all together, Frank Lloyd Wright would say, is nature. And so when you talk about his work, his architectural work, he's been influenced by Charles Rennie Mackintosh in Scotland. He's been influenced by Voysey and Bailey and other people in England. He's been influenced by design. He's got a book, we've got one in the visitor center, The Car is Architecture. And so the line and the rhythm of the whole thing work together. And in a natural setting, which is as beautiful as the one in Pennsylvania, is really made for sculpture. And it's this interaction between the natural environment and the man-made object that sits in it, which is either the house or the sculpture, or all of a piece. If it works, they all go together.
Lord Palumbo, I have two more questions for you.
Yeah.
I understand that in your youth you considered the priesthood.
Yes.
I remember reading back in the 1980s that Prince Philip gathered representatives from the world's religions in a series of reconciliation meetings, a very noble experiment. Were you part of that?
It is a wonderful, and it's still going. It's a noble venture, but I know exactly what they were trying to do because I studied it quite carefully. And the priest in London, he was the priest of the Church of St. Stephen, Walbrook, which is a most beautiful Wren building by Christopher Wren. He built 35 churches in the city of London. Chadvara was my sort of mentor with this movement to try and harness various religions worldwide. And I think it's done some good, but we're tending to live in a secular society now where it's not so important. But maybe it will come back. I don't know. I hope it does. And if it comes back, it'll come back because of people come to their senses and they realize that we all have to live together. That racism has no part to play in that, in that division that we find ourselves in now. And that religion too, we can reach across the aisle and live quite happily together. My wife, who's Lebanese, says that when she was a little girl in Lebanon, you had 16 different kinds of religion in Lebanon, all living together, Jews, Catholics, Orthodox Greeks, Muslims, Shia, Sunni, whatever, in perfect harmony. Nobody thought about anything else. And that was relatively recent. It was 50 years ago. So, yes, when I was at Oxford, it was called moral rearmament, which meant that you tried to improve yourself as a person morally before trying to improve others or finding others who were willing to be improved in that sort of way. It was a bit like John F. Kennedy's, army of people who went out.
Peace Corps, the Peace Corps.
Peace Corps, exactly. It was a bit like that.
Lord Palumbo, I want to ask just one last question.
Yes.
Just something silly. At Christmas time, do you and, let's say, 7 other lords get together and listen to holiday music and have maybe more than a few drinks by the fireplace, all full of Yuletide cheer? You know where this is going, right, Tom?
Sadly, yes, I do.
So, Lord Palumbo, do you and the other 7 lords, and there have to be exactly 7 for this to work, ever think about leaping?
I don't think we do. It's a lovely idea.
Because that would make the perfect Palumbo Christmas video.
Yes, I'm just trying to think. I suppose I could cobble together 7 of them.
Yes.
And we'd sing. What we do is, the family does, somewhat reluctantly, we go to midnight mass on Christmas Eve, and we sing a bit there in this beautiful church of St. Stephen, Walbrook, where the dome, Christopher Wren's dome, was the prototype for St. Paul's Cathedral.
Oh.
So it's a magnificent place. If your travels take you to London, look me up and I'll take you there.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Lord Palumbo, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for Modernist houses. 919-995-0550.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive Modernist archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century houses, and access 2.6 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Our esteemed guests get thoroughly Googled by Chief Researcher Cindy Stratton, the Greta Garbo of modernism. She just wants to be alone. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild, and we will be back soon with another stately, appropriate, across-the-pond, scones and tea, long live the Queen episode of U.S. Modernist Radio.